Georgina Godwin, and I am delighted to welcome you all to this event for Bologna Book Plus. Today, we'll be talking about the great Italian poet, writer, and philosopher Dante, as we mark 700 years since the writer's death. We'll be discussing Dante in translation and looking at his global contemporaries and how these writers continue to influence us now. Our esteemed panel of experts are Yao Yi, who's a literary editor and associate editor of Yilin Press, an imprint of Phoenix Publishing and Media Inc., one of the largest publishing groups in China. She's the editor of the 700th anniversary illustrated collection of the Divine Comedy in China. She's also the editorial director for the Chinese publications of renowned international writers, including Thomas Pynchon, Alice Munro, Molloy Sander, Doris Lessing, and Anne Beattie. Daniel Newman holds the chair of Arabic Studies at the University of Durham in the UK. His research and publications have centered on Arabic geographical and travel literature, with a special focus on Arab travelers to Europe, the 19th century Arab reform movements in Tunisia and Egypt, and medieval Islamic medicine and food culture. In 2009, he was the co-recipient of the World Award of the President of the Republic of Tunisia for Islamic Studies for the book entitled Muslim Women in Law and Society. His most recent book is a study, critical edition, and translation of a medieval Arabic culinary treatise entitled The Sultan's Feast, a 15th century Egyptian cookbook. And Jacob Blakesley, who is an associate professor in comparative literature and literary translation at the University of Leeds, where he co-directs the Leeds Centre for Dante Studies. He's written 2 books on poetry translation and poetry translators, and edited a 3rd book on the sociology of poetry translation. He's currently writing the first global history of Dante translations from the 15th century until today, and I hope we'll hear more about that when we hear him speak. He's also co-editing a volume on English translations of the Vita Nova for Routledge. He's one of the directors of the Leeds Studies in Dante and Routledge Studies in Literary Translations book series, and he chairs the John Dryden Translation Competition. So that's our wonderful panel, and I think I'll just jump straight in by asking you, Jacob, if you will, to give us a brief intro to Dante.
Thanks very much, Georgina. So Dante Alighieri was the most famous Italian writer of all time. He was born in Florence, Italy in 1265. He died in Ravenna, Italy, in exile in 1321. Besides the Divine Comedy, which I'll shortly introduce, he also wrote pioneering books of poetry like the Vita Nuova, or New Life, as we would say in English, which chronicled his love for his beloved Beatrice in poetry. He wrote treatises on language and politics, written in Latin, such as De Vulgari Eloquentia, or on vernacular eloquence in English, and Monarchia, or Monarchy, where Dante criticizes the Catholic Church and promotes the use of Italian language, which at that time was considered much less prestigious than Latin. Dante's masterpiece is called the Commedia in Italian, or comedy in English translation. We call it today the Divine Comedy, or Divina Commedia in Italian, because of a later Italian addition to the original title. He finished the Divine Comedy most likely in the year of his death in 1321, where he had been forced into exile owing to political strife in his native Florence. So Dante's work, the Divine Comedy, is a journey through the afterlife of a 14th century Catholic. His poem is divided into 3 parts: Hell, Purgatory, and Paradiso. Dante is led on his journey through Hell and Purgatory by his favorite poet, the Latin epic poet Virgil. In Paradiso, instead, Dante is led by his muse Beatrice, the same Beatrice from Dante's earlier work, La Vita Nuova, along with Saint Bernard. And at the end of Paradiso, at the end of the Divine Comedy, Dante experiences a vision of God. Dante's poem is written in the Florentine Italian dialect in stanzas of 3 verses, and he uses an interlocking rhyme scheme, which in Italian is called terza rima, or in English, 3rd rhyme, so that each stanza is connected to the following stanza. Dante's work formed the basis for modern Italian, and his wish for an autonomous Italian state would later be inspirational for 19th century Italian patriots who liberated Italy from foreign occupation, with Italy becoming an independent nation for the first time in 1861.
So let's then talk about the first translations of Dante's work, Jacob.
Yeah, thanks. So the reception of Dante's Divine Comedy has not been even throughout the ages. The first translations were in manuscript and during the 1400s into languages such as Catalan, Spanish, and Latin. The first published translations, however, which occurred in the 16th century, were into French and Spanish. However, with the Counter-Reformation, Dante's work took a deep dive in terms of popularity, both in Italy and abroad, and it was only towards the late 1700s that his work began to be translated once more, this time into German, and then the first English translation of the complete Divine Comedy occurred in 1802. And during the 1800s, then, especially owing to Romanticism, there was a huge onrush of translations into all sorts of European languages, especially English, French, German, and Spanish in the second half of the 19th century. And then there were plenty of translations into Russian, Polish, Central and Eastern European languages, especially as well in the first half of the 20th century. And also in the 20th century, we see the first translations into non-Western languages, such as Chinese, Arabic, Japanese, Turkish, Persian. And in fact, today, some of the most translation activity of the Divine Comedy is in fact into non-Western languages. There have been more recent translations into Chinese and Korean and Turkish than into most Western European languages.
Mm-hmm. So tell us more about the English translations.
So the first English translations were of the canticle Inferno during the 1780s. They took place, they were translated by Charles Rogers and Henry Boyd. And Boyd's translation in 1802 was the first complete translation, as I mentioned. But the most important translation of the Divine Comedy to English during the 19th century was Henry Francis Carey's pioneering 1814 version, which was circulated widely not only in the English-speaking world, but also in the British Empire, in India, and also in Asia. In the first American translation, however, was the great poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 1867 translation, whereas most early translations of Divine Comedy in English were published in the UK. There has been a decided shift towards the United States with far more translations during the late 20th century and early 21st century, published in American English, really. And there's been also a very considerable amount of translation activity by Irish poets and writers of Dante. One of the biggest problems, certainly issues faced by English language translators has been the question of religion, because Dante's poem is full of Catholic dogma, one might say. And so for Protestant English translators, they've had difficulty often dealing with that. And that's why Irish Catholic poets or American poets more used to Catholicism have sort of taken the lead in terms of translating Dante. There's been throughout the 200 years, really, of complete Dante translations in English, a mixture of translations, whether into free verse, most of them have been into what we would say is blank verse, that is iambic pentameter, which is the prestigious poetic meter. There have been a lot of translations into prose, especially by English language scholars. There's also been translations into terza rima, into Dante's rhyme scheme, but recently there have been very few of those. And the problem with a translator trying to reproduce Dante's innovative rhyme scheme, which Dante himself invented, is that we have very few rhyme words in English compared to Romance languages like Italian.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And let's cross to you, Daniel, now, and ask about Dante's reception in the Arab world. Now, that's been pretty controversial. Tell us more.
Yeah, there's a number of things that we can talk about, and I'd like to start with something that Jacob already mentioned. When you're dealing with what is essentially, I mean, as a translator or even a reader, a profoundly alien text, both linguistically, but especially culturally, This leads to a number of challenges, and it's a text that is so steeped in Christian, medieval Christian religious thought and dogma, but also, of course, replete with references to classical antiquity. And the cultural specificity is why, of course, one of the main reasons why canonical texts don't tend to travel very well, particularly when the recipient culture has a very strong, well-established literary tradition and conventions, often inextricably linked to religion, in this case, Islam. And in fact, I would say that in some cases, or some people might feel that suspicion hovers over anybody who shows perhaps an interest in a book that's called The Divine Comedy. In fact, even the title is problematic in the Arabic Muslim tradition. More significantly, however, there are some very practical points that we need to mention. Firstly, some of the content is considered blasphemous. Now, this much hay has been made of this, but in fact, in practice, we're talking about only very few verses. They are all concentrated in the Inferno, which, thanks to Jacob's wonderful introduction, we now know is the first part of the comedy, more specifically in Canto 28. And what are we dealing with here? Well, we have references to the Prophet Muhammad, as well as to his cousin and son-in-law, Ali, of course, who is worshipped by the Shiites. Now, the poet and Virgil, his guide, meet both of them in the 9th ditch. In Arabic, the word for ditch incidentally is wadi. And their punishment is described in graphic detail. And unfortunately, this particular section has come to almost symbolize Dante's comedy, unfortunately. Of course, by people who haven't read it. Thirdly, however, there's the element about the appropriation of alleged Muslim antecedents, and this is perhaps something that people are less aware of. Now, this has been prominent, in fact, not just in scholarship in the Arab world, but in fact, it started in Western Dante scholarship. Very briefly, the first person to provide an in-depth study of the alleged Eastern antecedents of the comedy was the Spanish Arabist and also Roman Catholic priest, incidentally, Asin Palacio. And he wrote a book on Muslim eschatology in Dante's comedy. And this was published already in 1919, so this goes back a long, so it's over 100 years ago now. And he discusses a plethora of similarities between the comedy and a number of Arabic sources, ranging from mystic poets, most notably among them a man called Abul Ala al-Ma'ri, who wrote a very famous work called The Treatise of Pardon or Forgiveness, to Sufism, to religious stories. And here the religious stories, particularly one story, which is that of the so-called Ascension of the Prophet Muhammad to the seven heavens, known in Arabic as the Mi'raj, which essentially is an embellishment of a Quranic verse. Now, though some of these comparisons don't really stand up to scrutiny, many of them actually do. And although it has to be said, Asin Palacios, so the Spanish Arabist, never really saw his work as a way to detract from Dante's creative genius, this hasn't always been the case for others who have, in fact, greatly exaggerated what they believe is the debt owed by Dante to Muslim sources. In one case, one observer going so far as to say that instead of Virgil, Dante should in fact have used an Arabic author as his guide.
But do we have evidence then that Dante had links with and knowledge of the Muslim world himself?
Indeed, we do. In fact, I can immediately link up to my point about Asin Palacios. One of the weaknesses of his book, which incidentally is wonderfully researched, and he was the first to really delve into the authentic material, the Arabic sources. The single biggest question left open was, how was this material mediated? How would Dante have known? So even if we accept that there was influence, how would Dante have known about this? Well, Dante, of course, was somebody, as we know, endowed with an insatiable curiosity. And of course, there are other Muslim Arab references in the comedy. We have, for instance, the great Ibn Sina, Avicenna, we have Saladin, Salah ad-Din, we have Averroes, Ibn Rushd, the great philosopher, who are also mentioned in the Inferno. And in one of Dante's other works, the Convivio, we have a few other people that are mentioned. We have, for instance, the very famous and important Muslim theologian, El-Ghazali, and we also have the astronomer El-Farghani, El-Fraghanus in the Latinized version. Now, the Mediterranean sphere at the time was very much one of intercultural and intercivilizational contact. Albeit often accompanied by violence. Just think of the Crusades, of course. And the 13th century in particular witnessed an intensification of relations between the Christian and Muslim Mediterranean worlds. Incidentally, in addition, of course, to the Crusades, there were also numerous links in terms of trade. And of course, let's not forget, through religion, the pilgrimage. The people would pass through, of course, the areas of the other, to use the term. And that period also has the presence of two visionary leaders. On the one hand, we have Frederick II, King of Sicily, with his court in Palermo. And on the other hand, we have in Spain, we have, of course, the great Alfonso X, the Wise. Now, these two people were very interested in the Arab Muslim world. In fact, Frederick spoke Arabic. And so what these people did, their role in actively promoting the Arabic culture or cultural output comes through their promotion of translation movement. And so in Spain, in that period, in Toledo, we have a very important translation movement where many of the Arabic scientific translated into Latin, then in Castilian Spanish, and then also in French and Latin. Incidentally, it's through this translation movement, of course, that the West gained access to many of the sources of antiquity. It is also through this translation that the great Ibn Sina, Avicenna, whom I've already mentioned, gained entry into Europe. Now, so we have all of this going on. Incidentally, the movement, the translation movement, so on the one hand, we have Spain, but it started actually in Italy in the 11th century with Constantine the African, then 12th century, mainly Toledo and so on. And then afterwards, we also have translators working in Italy. So this is an environment where somebody like Dante, you could well imagine, would have found it very easy to meet people who could instruct him. He would have access to sources and so on. Now, there's a few other strands here as well. And I'd like to go back to the book I mentioned, or the legend of the Ascension of the Prophet Muhammad. As it happens, in that period, and it is this book in particular, or this legend in particular, that shows a lot of similarities with the Divine Comedy. This particular book was actually translated from an anonymous Arabic text in the 13th century into Spanish, as well as into French and Latin. Now, this was done in Spain. However, Dante's mentor, Dante's teacher, Latini, was at one point, of course, an ambassador in Spain. And once again, we can imagine that he would have come into contact, after all, let's remember this is a small group of intellectuals, he would have come into contact with these translators, and it is not unlikely, in fact, it is not by any stretch of the imagination unlikely that he would have met and talked to some of these translators, and who knows, might have read this book. Latini himself didn't know Arabic, but it is perfectly conceivable that he would have brought the book back to Italy and showed it to his pupil, whom he knew had a great interest in such matters. But in fact, there is another source, another avenue that's worth examining, and that is that also various individuals who had traveled to the East, and one of the people that I've worked on is Ricoldo da Monte di Croce. Now, he was a Dominican priest or monk rather, and he had traveled to the East and learned Arabic very well indeed, and also became fully conversant with Islam. Now you can see here the picture I'm trying to paint here of this man whom one can imagine Dante would have been in contact with. And in fact, it is that same Ricoldo who, of course, he became conversant with Islam. Primarily, we are, after all, in the Christian Middle Ages, primarily to attack Islam. And one of his famous books is, in fact, a refutation of what he calls the Saracen law, which incidentally would later on, which became a bit of a bestseller, and which would later on even be translated by Martin Luther in German and printed as well.
What about censorship, though, in those Arabic translations?
Another very issue. Now, Arabic translations, people may be surprised to hear that there's quite a few, very few Dante's comedy into Arabic go back as far as the 1930s, early 1930s, that we have the very first complete translation. Incidentally, most of the translations have a transliteration of the word comedy, comedia. This one, the first one, which was published in Libya, stands out that there is no mention of the word comedy. Now, this translation completely fell into oblivion. And since then, there have been 5 others, but not all of them are complete. So the Inferno, for instance, is one that people tend to focus on. Now, the ones that are complete, there's 3 of them. There's the one in Libya. And then there's one in 1959 to 1963, published in Cairo. And then there's one that's published in 2002 in France. It's part of the UNESCO collection of important works. Now, the issue of censorship is, of course, a crucial one, particularly with regard to those sections that I've highlighted. And by the way, when it comes to other, let's say, problematic references, say scatological or sexual references, these pose much less of a problem in Arabic. It is really the religious references. And so how does this manifest itself? How are these offending passages cleaned up, as it were? And is it a case of overt or covert censorship? Now, the offending passages are, as I said, in Canto 28, usually between 29 and lines 29-33, or 22-33 rather, and then 61-63. Now, the 1959 to 63, so the 60s edition or translation, has an interesting way of dealing with this. There, it is total excision. So Canto 28 misses over 40 lines. They are just omitted. And in the case of the 2002 edition, we have what we can call compression. And so here, the translator doesn't completely cut them out, but he simply omits certain parts, the offending parts. And I'll give you 2 examples very simply. The name of the Prophet Muhammad, for instance, is elided and replaced by ellipsis, so 3 dots. That's one case. In another case, rather than naming the person, the translator, and I of course now translate back from the Arabic, simply says, the tormented one addressed these words to me, rather than Muhammad addressed these words to me. Next question is, as I've said, what kind of censorship are we dealing with here? Is this overt? Is it advertised? Is the reader told about the censorship or not? Is it official censorship? Well, in fact, it's not official censorship. It is really self-censorship on the part of the translators, preempting, of course, what would obviously turn into official censorship. And it is very overt. And both translators, admirably, do discuss this. And so the first translator, so the one who did the 1959-63 translation, says that he removed verses from this canto, and then I quote, "since I found them not worthy of translation." They mention the Prophet Muhammad, the finest blessings and peace upon him, and Dante made a huge mistake in doing so. Influenced, an interesting comment here, influenced by what was prevalent in his time among commoners and in books about the great prophet. So, of course, this is very true because it is written in a time, of course, when writing about Islam, in the West at least, was all about attacking Islam and the prophet. So that's the first translator by the name of Hassan Othman. We now turn to the 2002 version, where, if you remember, I used the word compressed translation. He too very honestly addresses this issue. And he says, Dante he's even more elusive in his reference to the emendation than the other translators. Dante devotes, I quote, Dante devotes his canto to the source of discord and the torture experienced by a foundational Islamic personage forces us to obscure it, instead of cutting entire verses, as our great predecessor, Hassan Othman, the translator of the first one, though he referred to the emendation in all honesty. We are drawing the reader's attention to the fact that these verses need to be read not in the sense that they intend to offend dignity, but rather that they reveal two contradictory movements. On the one hand, the background of a mutual sectarian background, which led to this personality and those like him being put in this place. And on the other, Dante's overwhelming emotion and distress when he sees this tormented soul in front of him.
Oh, interesting. Thank you. Let's cross to China now and speak to Yao Yi. I wonder if you could tell us about Dante's influence in China.
Yes. Dante has had a very profound influence in China since it was first introduced to readers at the end of the 19th century. His work has been translated by several acclaimed scholars and translators from both Italian and English throughout the last 100 years. Since Dante was introduced to China at the end of the 19th century, his work has had a profound impact on major Chinese social and political figures, such as Liang Qichao, who had worked on the political reformation of modern China from the Qing dynasty. And the thoughts and ideas in Dante's work have led major historical events in China. For example, the 100-day reform movement of 1898, a national cultural, political, and educational reform movement that resulted in abolishment of the traditional exam system and the establishment of Peking University as a place where sciences, liberal arts, and the Chinese classics would all be available for study. Dante's work also had a significant influence on Chinese intellectuals and writers, such as Lu Xun. Lu Xun is the father of modern China literature. Lu Xun and Dante represent the most influential men of letters in China and Italy. Though they lived in different ages and their works were distinctively rhetorically, the spirit of their works are common. In the year of 2018, a trans-time and space literary dialogue was hosted by the descendants of Lu Xun and Dante in Shanghai. Zhou Linfeng, the grandson of Lu Xun, and Sperlu, the 19th generation grandson of Dante, they discussed the contributions and common features of their ancestors' works. In addition to Lu Xun, contemporary Chinese literature writers and educators such as Hu Shi, Mao Dun, Lao She, and Ba Jing are also greatly inspired by Dante's The Divine Comedy. Dante's thoughts had a remarkable influence in their literary works in the 20th century in China.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Can you take us back though and tell us a little bit about the history of translation? When was the first translation?
Okay. I would like to give you an overview of the timeline and history of the translation and publications of Divine Comedy in China. And my introduction is greatly inspired by a Chinese scholar of Italian literature, Professor Wen Zhen in Beijing Foreign Studies University. In China, Qian Daosun was the first person to translate the Divine Comedy. Qian Daosun went to Italy with his parents, studied at the University of Rome, and majored in Italian literature. After returning to China, he devoted himself to translating the first 3 poems in Inferno, which was published in the Dante special issue of Novel Monthly on the occasion of the 600th anniversary of Dante's death. In December 1924, the Shanghai Commercial Press published a pamphlet of the Divine Comedy selected poems. Although Qian Daosun's translation is only 5 poems, it has always been regarded as the most artistic translation of the Divine Comedy. He chose the language style of Chu Ci. Chu Ci is an anthology of Chinese poetry in 221 BC, during the warring states in China, partially retaining the rhyme and rhythm of the original poem, and it flows elegantly in Chinese. The first full Chinese translation of Divine Comedy was written by a mathematician and physicist. In 1934, Wang Weike began a 10-year translation work with his admiration and love for Dante. The first volume, Inferno, was translated in mid-March of the following year, but due to the outbreak of World War II in China in 1937, this translation was not published until 1939 by Shanghai Commercial Press. After a break of 8 years, in 1943, Wang Weike resumed his translation, and it took more than a year to complete the translation of Purgatory and Paradiso. In 1948, the Commercial Press divided the 3 parts of the Divine Comedy into 3 volumes and published them together. The full translation of China's first Divine Comedy has finally come out. Wang Weike's translation did not use rhyme-like poetic translation, but faithfully narrated the content of the original poem in the form of prose. Almost at the same time as Wang Weike, another translator, Zhu Weiji, also began to translate the Divine Comedy. Zhu Weiji is a Shanghai poet. The version he translated was published by Shanghai Literature and Art Publishing House and Shanghai Translation Publishing House. It was a bestseller and is still being reprinted now. Zhu Weiji's translation work probably started around 1935, but it was not until 1942 the first draft was complete, and the 1950s until it was finally published. Zhu Weiji translated from the English version. He did not choose the same prose style as Wang Weike's. Instead, he used free new poem style, which he was good at. The translation has a good natural flow, but some obscure sentences appear, and sometimes, due to the lack of footnotes, it is hard for readers to understand particular verses. In addition, although the number of lines in this translation is the same as the original poem, it does not pay attention to rhyme. Also in 1935, another translator translated the volume Inferno. He also chose free-form poetry as the form of translation. This translator was called Yu Gengyu, a well-known 20th century Romantic Chinese poet. In 1935, Yu Gengyu went to the University of London to study the history of European literature. While in England, he set out to translate Inferno. This translation was first published in the supplement of Republic of China Daily in 1936. Yu Gengyu relied on his own understanding of poetry and proficient rhetoric skills. His translation reads very poetically, which is similar to Qian Daosun's Chu Ci, ancient poems. In contrast, Yu Gengyu's translation of vernacular poems may better reflect Dante's proposition of writing in popular saying. But in the end, Yu Gengyu failed to translate Purgatory and Paradiso together. After the end of Cultural Revolution in China, the translation of and study of Dante's works resumed. In 1982, Peking University professor Tian De Wang began to translate the Divine Comedy from the original Italian. The translator spent 18 years not only translating the original text, but also compiling a large number of annotations. The number of words in annotations reached 3 times that of the main text. Tian De Wang's translation is prose, because in his opinion, if the translator himself is not a poet, he would have to reluctantly translate into poetry. In 2000, when Tian De Wang passed away, another full translation of the Divine Comedy was published directly from the original Italian by translator Huang Wenjie. Huang adopted the form of free-form poetry. In his translation, the number of lines remained the same as that of the original. Although the length of each line was different, the rhyme could be ensured as much as possible, and it would be more poetic when read. Huang's translation also has more than 4,000 annotations. In the selection of the original version, Huang Wenjie referred to the 2 editions of the Divine Comedy by New Italy Publishing House and Lemonia Press as the original version, including annotations and a compilation. These 2 versions are also recognized as authoritative. Huang Wenjie's translation has been published by Ealing Press. Yes.
Yeah. So you're actually working right now on a book about it. Tell us about the work that you're publishing to commemorate the 700th anniversary.
Thank you. To commemorate Dante's 7th anniversary in May this year, in May, Ealing Press published an illustrated edition of the Divine Comedy translated by Huang Wenjie.
There it is.
Yes. And this is Inferno. Huang's translation of the Divine Comedy has been published by Ealing Press for 15 years and has undergone 3 reprints. Both the translator and the editors have worked tirelessly to revise the editions to perfection. The new edition contains a large number of illustrations. Here we are. By the famous French illustrator Gustave Doré in the 19th century. It also includes Dante's It also includes Dante's Chinese-Italian bilingual recitation audio in audiobook format, co-produced by the Albert Theatre and the Ravenna Theatre, which with support from the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Thank you.
So Jacob, you're also working on a new book right now. Tell us about that.
Thanks, Georgina. Yeah, so I'm writing the first global history of Dante translations throughout the world of the Divine Comedy, in which I start with the first manuscript translations in the 1400s and go down to the present day. And I analyze also, thanks to the work of lots of scholars from around the world, translations into languages from Afrikaans to Yiddish, or even Chinese and Arabic, with the advice of scholars in the field and of critical scholarship I've read, trying to see how Dante's comedy has been translated, and all of the various issues that come up inevitably when such a multi-layered poetic text is transplanted into a new environment. I mean, we've talked, for example, today, especially Daniel, about issues of translation in the Arabic-speaking world, which is a fascinating topic. And I mean, if we just think about the very translations of the canticles themselves of, excuse me, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, well, I mean, we might think that they're readily translatable, but it's actually not the case at all, because the very notion of Inferno as a permanent place of punishment, an eternal place of punishment in Catholic religion, is not the idea of hell shared by the majority of world religions, whether we're talking about Judaism and Islam, where punishment is usually not eternal for a vast majority of sinners, or whether we're talking about other religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. So when we're talking about especially the translation of Dante in China or in India, I mean, in Chinese, for example, and Yao can correct me if I'm wrong, but the translation of Inferno is by a Chinese term Diyu, which refers not to a permanent realm of hell, but rather to sort of a provisional hell that would be more like Dante's notion of purgatory, because for Dante, a purgatorial realm is where people who have sinned are able to, however, progress and advance all the way eventually to Paradiso. And of course, the very notion of purgatory is not only foreign, however, to many religions. Judaism and Islam don't have the structured idea of purgatory that Catholicism does, and neither do Buddhism and Hinduism. But the very notion of paradise is not the same as well. Obviously, for Dante, Paradiso is a place of bliss where with Jesus and Mary and so forth. But in religions like Islam and Judaism, paradise is conceived of in a far different way. In Buddhism, paradise is certainly not a place where paradise is not the ultimate end goal. You want to escape the cycle of reincarnation. And so the vast cultural and religious differences of the comedy is what I try to also address in my book.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder how, if you could just talk a little bit about writers or literature in the UK during Dante's lifetime, people that were perhaps feeding into his work, and indeed the other way around.
Sure. So it was basically only a one-way direction of influence from Dante to English language literature. But even, I mean, if we think about the 14th century, the greatest English writer then was Geoffrey Chaucer, and Chaucer was quite influenced by Dante. He read Dante. You can find retellings of Dante episodes from the Divine Comedy, such as Ugolino in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Chaucer was also the first person in English to try to use Dante's innovative rhyme scheme of Terza Rima in A Complaint to His Lady. Chaucer's work, The House of Fame, has been considered by scholars to be a parody of Dante's comedy. But the other English language writers during the 14th century, more or less contemporary with Dante or slightly later, didn't show any, however, influence. So John Gower, there's no reference to Gower knowing anything about Dante's work, although he mentions him once. And nor is Dante's comedy or work mentioned in Gawain and the Green Knight or Piers Plowman. So you'll have to wait after Chaucer until Milton in the 17th century to find an English language writer who has a sophisticated dialogue with Dante once again.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Daniel, just bringing this up to the present day, I wonder how Dante continues, or perhaps not, but continues to have an influence in your area of study.
I'm afraid the answer to that is not as elaborate, or can't be really as elaborate as Jacob's, because truth be told, let us not forget that there wasn't really a single reference to Dante prior to the 19th century. We're talking a mere reference. The Arab world, of course, had major translation movements, the first already in the Middle Ages, but there was no interest in foreign literatures, as in belles lettres, to use the usual term. It was only the sciences that were of interest. And of course, as I've said, this is linked to the very well-established literary tradition in that culture, particularly in poetry. And even in the 19th century, it's only very late that European literature, rather than European scientific or technological literature, begins to be translated. And it's aimed really at a very small elite of modernists, for want of a better term. And in the 21st century, nothing much, as far as I can tell, has really changed. So yes, we've had translations, but if one was to take a straw poll, and on occasion I have done that, talking to colleagues who are educated people, if you were to ask somebody working in European literature at a university in Western Europe about Dante, you'd probably find that many of them would have written at least part of the work and would be familiar at least with for instance, the importance in terms of linguistic innovation and so on. In the Arabic-speaking world, that isn't the case. So his influence, I would say, has been and continues to be extremely minimal. That is not to say, of course, that you won't have people who are inspired in some way by it, but this is an infinitesimally small minority. So Dante, and I truly believe that it's a combination. On the one hand, the religious connotation, the bad religious connotation that the work has acquired, and secondly also that it is a work of poetry essentially, and poetry is such an integral part of Arabic literature. It really is the flagship of Arabic literature, that there is generally very little interest in foreign poetry. So Dante in the Arabic-speaking world is not a major player, and I don't expect him to be actually in the future.
And Lily, the same question really to you. Does Dante continue to be an influence to Chinese writers? Lily, I'm not sure if you can, I beg your pardon, Yao Yi, I'm not sure if you can hear me. Does Dante continue to be an influence on Chinese literature today?
Yes, of course. And as far as I know, more translations and editions of the Divine Comedy will come out this year. And also a translation of Dante's New Life has been published in China. Chinese writers are reading these versions, reading these editions.
And as are we all, and we will look forward very much to your book, and of course to yours, to yours, Jacob. Many thanks to all three of you, to Daniel, to Yao Yi, and to Jacob. And as a final treat, before we go, we've got a special reading of Dante's work by the poet, writer, and spoken word artist Scarlett Sabat. Here she is reading My Lady by Dante. I hope you enjoy.